Hey everyone. Tonight, we're descending into one of the most haunting and misunderstood stories ever told. A tale of beauty, betrayal, and transformation. A woman whose name became a synonym for terror, whose gaze could turn life itself into cold stone, and whose tragedy still whispers through the ruins of time. Her name is Medusa. But tonight, we're not telling the myth you think you know. We're peeling back 3,000 years of retellings, distortions, and deliberate blame to uncover the truth that ancient poets tried to bury. The story of a devoted priestess who was violated, a victim who was cursed, and a monster the gods themselves created. So before we begin this descent into myth and memory, take a moment to like this video if you love exploring the hidden sides of history, and subscribe to Comfy History for more long-form journeys into the past. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is there. There's something almost poetic about diving into a story like this when the world outside is quiet and the shadows start to move. Now, dim the lights, maybe light a candle, take a deep breath, and let's step together into the ancient world. Tonight, we're not just telling a myth, we're uncovering a truth buried beneath stone, silence, and fear. This is the entire story of Medusa, and it begins not with a monster, but with a young woman who believed the gods would protect her. Close your eyes and imagine ancient Greece, not the marble-white tourist postcards or Hollywood epic version, but the real thing. The air thick with incense and olive oil, the sound of sandaled feet on worn stone, the constant murmur of voices speaking in dialects that have been dead for millennia. This is Athens in its golden age, somewhere around the 5th century before the Common Era, when the Parthenon was still gleaming with fresh paint and the goddess Athena was more than mythology. She was real, present, a divine force that shaped the daily lives of everyone who walked her sacred city. In this world lived a young woman named Medusa. And here's the first thing you need to understand about her story. She was beautiful. Not just pretty, not just attractive. Beautiful in a way that stopped conversations, that made people turn and stare, that inspired poets and artists and probably more than a few marriage proposals from wealthy Athenian fathers looking to secure advantageous matches for their sons. But Medusa wasn't interested in marriage. She wasn't interested in the conventional life mapped out for most young women of her time. A brief childhood, an arranged marriage, a life of bearing children and managing household affairs while her husband conducted the real business of the world. No, Medusa had chosen a different path entirely. She had chosen to serve Athena. This wasn't a decision made lightly. Becoming a priestess of Athena meant taking vows of chastity that would last her entire life. It meant dedicating herself completely to the service of the goddess, spending her days in ritual observance, tending the sacred flame, caring for the temple, and maintaining the complex web of ceremonies that kept the divine world connected to the mortal one. Why would a beautiful young woman choose this life? In a world where women had precious few options for independence, the priesthood offered something rare: autonomy. A priestess of Athena held real power, real respect, real authority. She could own property, make decisions, speak in public forums. She was under the protection of the goddess herself, which meant she was essentially untouchable by mortal law and custom. Medusa's beauty wasn't lost on those around her, but it was consecrated beauty, sacred beauty, beauty that belonged not to any man, but to the goddess. She walked through Athens with her head held high, her hair carefully arranged in the complex styles befitting her station, her chiton flowing around her like water. People noticed her, whispered about her, but they also respected her. She was Athena's chosen, Athena's beloved, Athena's priestess. The irony, of course, is staggering. This woman who would become the most feared monster in Greek mythology began as perhaps the most protected woman in all of Athens. She lived within the sacred precinct of the Parthenon, surrounded by other priestesses, under the direct guardianship of the city's patron goddess. If anyone in ancient Athens should have been safe from harm, it was Medusa. But safety, as we'll discover, is often an illusion. And the gods, as mortals learned again and again, are not always the protectors we hope them to be. Medusa's daily life would have followed the ancient rhythms of temple service. She rose before dawn to tend the sacred fire that burned continuously in Athena's honor. She participated in the morning libations, pouring wine and oil onto the altar while reciting prayers that had been passed down through generations of priestesses. She helped prepare the elaborate sacrifices that marked holy days, assisted visiting pilgrims who came to seek the goddess's favor, and maintained the sacred objects that were kept within the temple's inner chambers. Her fellow priestesses were her family, her sisters in service. They shared meals, shared stories, shared the quiet satisfaction that came from living a life of purpose and devotion. Medusa was respected among them, perhaps even envied for her exceptional beauty, but beauty in service to the goddess was considered a gift that enhanced the honor of the entire temple. She would have learned to read and write, skills that were far from universal among women of her time. She studied the sacred texts, memorized the complex genealogies of gods and heroes, and became an expert in the intricate protocols that governed divine worship. Her mind was as cultivated as her appearance was striking. And here's what makes her story so particularly tragic. Medusa chose this life. She wasn't forced into temple service by poverty or family obligation. She came to Athena's temple as a willing supplicant, drawn by genuine devotion and the promise of a life lived in direct service to the divine. She believed, with the fervent faith of youth, that dedicating herself to Athena would protect her, guide her, and give her life meaning. She believed the goddess would keep her safe. That belief, as beautiful and innocent as Medusa herself, was about to be shattered in the most brutal way imaginable. But before we reach that dark turning point, we need to understand the world Medusa inhabited, the sacred space she called home, and the goddess she served with such unwavering devotion. Because to understand why her transformation was so devastating, we first need to understand what she lost. The Temple of Athena Parthenos wasn't just a building. It was the beating heart of Athenian religious and political life, a place where the mortal and divine worlds intersected daily. And for a young priestess like Medusa, it was the center of the universe. The Parthenon rises from the Acropolis like a marble prayer frozen in stone, its columns reaching toward the heavens in perfect mathematical harmony. But in Medusa's time, this wasn't the weathered tourist attraction we know today. This was a living temple, alive with color, sound, and constant activity. The marble wasn't bare white, but painted in brilliant blues, reds, and golds. The massive bronze doors gleamed in the Mediterranean sun, and the air around the temple hummed with prayers, offerings, and the everyday business of serving the gods. Inside, the temple was dominated by the colossal statue of Athena Parthenos, 40 feet tall and covered in gold and ivory. The goddess stood in her full regalia, helmet on her head, shield at her side, a small figure of Nike, the goddess of victory, perched in her outstretched palm. This wasn't just a statue. To the ancient Greeks, this was Athena herself, present and watchful, blessing her city and her people. For Medusa, this statue was the focal point of her entire existence. She began each day by offering prayers and libations before it, and she ended each day the same way. The goddess's carved eyes seemed to follow her as she moved through her duties, a constant reminder that she was never alone, never unobserved, never unprotected. The temple complex was vast, including not just the main sanctuary but living quarters for the priestesses, storage rooms for the sacred implements, kitchens for preparing ritual meals, and workshops where the elaborate textiles and ceremonial objects used in worship were created. Medusa lived here, worked here, found her identity and purpose here. Her duties were complex and varied. As one of the senior priestesses, she was responsible for maintaining the sacred fire that burned continuously in Athena's honor. This fire was never allowed to die. It had been burning for generations, tended by an unbroken line of dedicated women. The responsibility was enormous. If the fire went out during her watch, it would be seen as a catastrophic omen, a sign that the goddess had withdrawn her favor from the city. She also participated in the elaborate festivals that marked the religious calendar. The Panathenaea, held every 4 years, was the most important of these. For days, the entire city would celebrate Athena with processions, sacrifices, athletic competitions, and the presentation of a new peplos, a sacred robe, to the goddess. Medusa would have played a central role in these celebrations, helping to organize the ceremonies, prepare the offerings, and maintain the sacred protocols that ensured everything proceeded according to divine will. But her most important duty, and the one that would ultimately lead to her doom, was maintaining the purity of the temple. Athena was a virgin goddess, and her temple was meant to be an inviolate space, protected from anything that might contaminate its sacred nature. The priestesses who served her had to maintain their own purity as well, both physical and spiritual. They couldn't marry, couldn't engage in sexual relationships, couldn't even entertain thoughts of romantic love without compromising their sacred vows. This wasn't seen as a hardship, but as a privilege. To be chosen for such service was to be elevated above the ordinary concerns of mortal life. The priestesses were respected, revered, and protected. They held real power in Athenian society, advising on matters of state, interpreting omens, and serving as intermediaries between the human and divine worlds. Medusa embraced this role completely. She was known for her piety, her dedication, and her unwavering commitment to the goddess. Other priestesses looked up to her. Young women in the city saw her as an example to emulate, and even the most powerful men in Athens treated her with respectful deference. The temple was her world, and she was content in that world. She had found purpose, identity, and security in service to Athena. She believed, with absolute conviction, that she was under the goddess's protection. After all, what could harm someone who had dedicated her life to serving the divine? The temple's daily rhythm was as predictable as the rising and setting of the sun. Dawn brought the morning prayers and the tending of the sacred fire. The day brought pilgrims seeking the goddess's blessing, officials consulting on matters of state, and the constant work of maintaining the sacred space. Evening brought more prayers, more offerings, and the quiet satisfaction of another day lived in service to something greater than herself. Medusa's fellow priestesses were her closest companions. They shared everything: meals, prayers, joys, sorrows, and the deep sense of purpose that came from their shared dedication. They were bound together not just by their vows, but by genuine affection and mutual respect. The temple was more than a workplace. It was a community, a family, a sanctuary in the truest sense of the word. And at the center of it all was Athena herself, wise, powerful, protective. The goddess who had sprung fully grown from Zeus's head, who had given Athens the olive tree, who was known for her justice, her strategic thinking, and her fierce protection of those who served her faithfully. Medusa believed absolutely in that protection. She had given her life to Athena, and in return, she expected the goddess to watch over her, to shield her from harm, to honor the devotion she had shown. That faith was about to be tested in the most brutal way possible, because the gods, as mortals learned again and again, have their own priorities, their own conflicts, their own blindnesses. And sometimes, the innocent become casualties in divine politics they never understood. As Medusa went about her duties on what seemed like just another ordinary day in the temple, she had no way of knowing that one of the most powerful gods in the Greek pantheon had noticed her beauty and decided he wanted to possess it. She had no way of knowing that her life was about to be shattered by a crime so devastating that it would transform not just her body, but the very nature of her existence. She was Athena's priestess, Athena's beloved, Athena's chosen. She believed that meant she was safe. She was about to learn how wrong she was. The god of the sea did not announce his arrival. There were no trumpets, no divine proclamations, no warnings whispered by prophetic birds. Poseidon came to Athena's temple like a storm surge, sudden and devastating, transforming a sacred space into a crime scene in moments. We need to understand what this meant in the context of ancient Greek religion and society. Poseidon wasn't just any god. He was one of the big three, brother to Zeus and Hades, ruler of all the oceans that surrounded the Greek world. His power was vast, his temper legendary, and his appetite for mortal women well documented in countless myths and stories. When Poseidon wanted something, he took it. The concept of consent was rarely a consideration for the gods. But this wasn't just any temple, and Medusa wasn't just any woman. This was Athena's most sacred space, and she was Athena's devoted priestess. The violation that was about to occur wasn't just a crime against Medusa. It was an act of cosmic sacrilege, a direct assault on the authority and dignity of another major deity. The ancient sources are frustratingly vague about the exact details of what happened, probably because the crime was too horrific for even myth to describe directly. What we know is this: Poseidon entered Athena's temple, found Medusa alone, and sexually assaulted her. The violence of the act was compounded by its location. This wasn't just rape. This was rape in the most sacred space in Athens, a desecration that contaminated the very heart of the city's religious life. Imagine Medusa's terror. She was a young woman who had dedicated her life to serving the gods, who believed absolutely in their justice and protection. She had taken vows of chastity, not just to Athena, but as a fundamental part of her identity as a priestess. Her purity wasn't just personal, it was sacred, essential to her ability to serve the goddess. And now one of the most powerful gods in the pantheon was destroying all of that with casual brutality. She couldn't fight him. He was immortal, divine, infinitely more powerful than any mortal. She couldn't call for help. Who would dare intervene in the affairs of the gods? She couldn't even run. The temple that had been her sanctuary was now her prison. The assault itself was traumatic enough, but the location made it infinitely worse. Poseidon didn't just rape Medusa. He raped her in front of Athena's sacred statue, under the very eyes of the goddess she served. The symbolism was unmistakable. This was Poseidon asserting his power not just over a mortal woman, but over his niece, sending a message that even Athena's most sacred spaces were not beyond his reach. When it was over, Poseidon simply left. Gods don't face consequences for their actions, don't apologize to their victims, don't acknowledge the devastation they leave behind. He returned to his underwater palace, probably giving the incident no more thought than a human might give to stepping on an ant. But Medusa was left behind, broken and defiled in the sacred space that had been her entire world. The physical trauma was only the beginning. She had been violated not just as a woman, but as a priestess. Her sacred vows had been shattered through no fault of her own. Her purity, so essential to her role in the temple, had been destroyed by divine violence. Worse, she was trapped in an impossible position. In ancient Greek society, rape victims were often blamed for their assault, especially if they had been alone or in circumstances that could be construed as improper. But Medusa had done nothing wrong. She had been exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was supposed to do, under the protection of the goddess she served. And what about that goddess? Where was Athena during the assault? The ancient Greeks believed their gods were omnipresent within their temples, constantly aware of what transpired in their sacred spaces. Did Athena see what happened to her priestess? Did she watch as her uncle violated her temple and her faithful servant? The questions that must have tormented Medusa in the aftermath are heartbreaking to contemplate. Had she somehow failed the goddess? Had she done something to deserve this? Was this punishment for some unknown transgression? Or had the goddess simply not cared enough to protect her? The psychological trauma of sexual assault is devastating under any circumstances, but for a woman whose entire identity was built around her sacred purity and divine protection, the assault was soul-destroying. Everything she believed about herself, about the gods, about the nature of divine justice, had been shattered in a single act of violence. She was alone in ways that few people can imagine. She couldn't tell her fellow priestesses. The shame and contamination she felt would make her an outcast. She couldn't seek justice through human courts. Who would believe that a god had committed this crime? And who would dare to prosecute him even if they did? She couldn't even pray for comfort to the goddess she served. That goddess had either been powerless to protect her or had chosen not to. The ancient sources don't dwell on Medusa's emotional state in the immediate aftermath of the assault, but we can imagine the depth of her despair. She had given everything to Athena, and in her moment of greatest need, that devotion had offered her no protection. She was trapped in the very temple where she had been violated, forced to continue her duties as if nothing had happened, as if her world hadn't been completely destroyed. Days passed, perhaps weeks. Medusa struggled to maintain the facade of normalcy, to continue her sacred duties while dying inside. She tended the sacred fire with hands that trembled. She offered prayers to a goddess who had failed to protect her. She went through the motions of a life that no longer had any meaning. And then Athena returned to her temple. The goddess's reaction to finding her sacred space defiled and her priestess violated would determine Medusa's fate. In a just world, Athena would have comforted her faithful servant, punished Poseidon for his crime, and restored the sanctity of her temple. Medusa had done nothing wrong. She was the victim, not the perpetrator. But the gods, as mortals learned again and again, are not bound by human concepts of justice or compassion. And Athena's response to the violation of her temple and her priestess would prove to be almost as devastating as the original crime. Because instead of protecting her victim, Athena chose to punish her. When Athena discovered what had transpired in her temple, her rage was immediate and terrible. But that rage, with a cruelty that still takes the breath away, was not directed at her uncle Poseidon, the god who had committed the crime. Instead, it fell like a thunderbolt on Medusa, the victim who had already suffered more than any mortal should endure. The transformation that followed has become the stuff of legend, but the psychological horror of what actually happened to Medusa is often lost in the dramatic retelling. This wasn't just a magical makeover or a simple curse. This was the systematic destruction of everything that had made Medusa who she was, carried out by the very goddess she had served with unwavering devotion. Picture the scene. Medusa, already broken by trauma and despair, suddenly finds herself face to face with Athena. The goddess she had worshipped, the divine protector she had trusted with her life, was finally here. For a moment, Medusa might have felt a surge of hope. Surely Athena would understand. Surely she would offer comfort, justice, protection. Instead, Athena's eyes blazed with fury, and her voice, when she spoke, was cold as winter stone. "You have defiled my temple," the goddess declared. "Not my temple has been defiled, or you have been wronged in my temple." The blame, the responsibility, the guilt was placed squarely on Medusa's shoulders. The victim was being held accountable for the crime committed against her. The transformation began immediately. Medusa's beautiful hair, which she had worn in the elaborate styles befitting a priestess, began to writhe and change. Each strand thickened, lengthened, became something alive and serpentine. Within moments, her head was crowned not with lustrous locks, but with a mass of hissing snakes, their scales gleaming with unnatural colors, their eyes glowing with malevolent intelligence. But the snakes were just the beginning. Medusa's face, which had been so beautiful that it stopped conversations and inspired poetry, became something horrific to behold. Her skin grew rough and scaled, her teeth became fangs, her tongue forked like a serpent's. Her eyes, which had once sparkled with intelligence and devotion, became instruments of death. Anyone who looked directly into them would be turned instantly to stone. Her body changed as well. Some sources describe her growing wings, bronze and terrible, that marked her as one of the monsters rather than one of the blessed. Her hands became claws, her voice became a shriek that could drive mortals mad with terror. The physical transformation was devastating enough, but the psychological impact was infinitely worse. Athena wasn't just changing Medusa's appearance, she was obliterating her identity. The beautiful priestess who had dedicated her life to serving the gods was being turned into the thing she would have feared most, a monster that threatened everything sacred and holy. And the cruelest irony of all, the very gaze that turned others to stone meant that Medusa could never again look upon another living being. She was condemned to complete isolation, cut off from all human contact by the curse that made her mere presence deadly. The woman who had lived surrounded by fellow priestesses, who had found identity and purpose in community, was now doomed to eternal loneliness. Athena's justification for this horrific punishment reveals the twisted logic of divine justice in the ancient world. The goddess claimed that Medusa had allowed herself to be violated in the sacred temple, that her presence there during the assault had contaminated the holy space. Never mind that Medusa was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was supposed to do. Never mind that she had no power to resist a god. Never mind that she was the victim of a violent crime. In Athena's eyes, Medusa's purity had been destroyed, and a priestess without purity was an abomination that had to be removed from civilized society. The fact that the impurity had been forced upon her was irrelevant. The fact that she had done nothing wrong was irrelevant. She had become something unclean, and therefore she had to be punished. But there's another layer to Athena's response that makes it even more chilling. Some scholars argue that the goddess was actually punishing Medusa not for being violated, but for being beautiful enough to attract Poseidon's attention in the first place. In this interpretation, Medusa's beauty itself was seen as a crime, a dangerous weapon that had disrupted the peace of the temple and attracted unwanted divine attention. This victim-blaming mentality is horrifying by modern standards, but it was disturbingly common in ancient societies. Women were often held responsible for the violence committed against them, especially if they were considered beautiful or desirable. The logic was circular and cruel. If a woman was assaulted, she must have done something to provoke it, and therefore she deserved whatever consequences followed. Athena's transformation of Medusa can also be read as an act of divine politics. As a goddess, Athena couldn't directly confront Poseidon without risking a war between major Olympian deities. Punishing a mortal, even an innocent one, was much safer and easier. Medusa became a scapegoat, a sacrifice offered up to preserve divine harmony at the cost of mortal justice. The transformation itself was designed to be as psychologically devastating as possible. Medusa wasn't just made ugly, she was made into the antithesis of everything she had once been. Where she had once brought beauty and serenity to the temple, she now brought horror and death. Where she had once been a conduit between mortals and the divine, she now served as a warning of what happened to those who somehow displeased the gods. And the snakes that replaced her hair? In Greek culture, serpents were symbols of wisdom and renewal, creatures associated with the earth goddess and feminine power. By transforming Medusa's hair into snakes, Athena was corrupting those symbols, turning them into instruments of terror rather than wisdom. The ability to turn others to stone was perhaps the cruelest aspect of the curse. It ensured that Medusa could never again experience human contact, never again know the comfort of companionship or the warmth of another's touch. She was condemned to exist in a state of permanent isolation, surrounded by the stone statues of those unfortunate enough to have looked upon her. As the transformation completed itself, Medusa found herself no longer welcome in the temple that had been her home. She was driven out into the wilderness, an exile from the only world she had ever known. The other priestesses, her sisters in service, could no longer bear to look upon her. The pilgrims who had once sought her blessing now fled in terror at the mere rumor of her presence. She had been transformed from victim to monster, from beloved priestess to feared outcast, from protected servant of the gods to enemy of all mortal life, and all for the crime of being beautiful, being alone, and being in the wrong place when a god decided to commit an act of violence. The woman who had once believed absolutely in divine justice had become living proof that such justice was often nothing more than a comforting illusion. Medusa's transformation was complete, and her real torment was just beginning, because now she had to learn how to live as a monster in a world that would never show her mercy. The exile from Athens was not a journey, but a flight. Medusa fled the city that had been her home, the temple that had been her sanctuary, the life that had given her purpose and identity. Behind her lay everything she had ever known or loved. Ahead lay only the unknown wilderness and the terrible weight of her transformation. Where does a monster go when the civilized world has cast her out? For Medusa, the answer was as far from human habitation as possible. The ancient sources place her ultimate refuge at the edge of the known world, in a desolate land where the very air seemed thick with dread, and the sun struggled to penetrate persistent mists. Some accounts describe her making her way to the far western shores of Africa, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, in a realm where the normal rules of geography and reality seemed suspended. Others place her on a mysterious island somewhere in the unknown reaches of the Mediterranean, a place that existed more in legend than on any map. The journey itself must have been a nightmare. Medusa could no longer look directly at any living creature without killing it, which meant she had to travel with her eyes downcast or covered, navigating by sound and instinct rather than sight. Every encounter with another traveler ended in tragedy. Every glimpse of her reflection in water or polished metal was a reminder of what she had become. She couldn't seek shelter in inns or taverns. Her presence would have turned them into tombs filled with stone statues. She couldn't buy food or supplies. Merchants who caught sight of her face were immediately petrified. She was forced to scavenge, to steal from the dead, to survive on whatever she could find in the wilderness. And always, she was alone. The psychological impact of this isolation cannot be overstated. Humans are social creatures by nature, and Medusa had been particularly so. She had thrived in the community of the temple, had found identity and purpose in her relationships with fellow priestesses and worshippers. Now she was condemned to a solitude so complete it bordered on madness. The landscape she eventually claimed as her territory was as desolate as her new existence. Ancient writers describe it as a place of perpetual twilight, where the sun seemed afraid to shine too brightly, and the very stones seemed to whisper with malevolent voices. The air was thick and oppressive, filled with an unnatural stillness that suggested death rather than peace. Here, in this forsaken realm, Medusa made her home. Not a home in any recognizable sense, but a lair, a hiding place, a refuge where she could exist without accidentally destroying innocent lives. The descriptions that have come down to us paint a picture of almost unbearable bleakness. A cave or ruined structure surrounded by the stone statues of those who had been unfortunate enough to encounter her. These statues were not decorative art but monuments to tragedy. Each one had once been a living being, a lost traveler who had stumbled into her territory, a hero seeking glory by hunting the famous monster, a sailor blown off course by storms. They stood frozen in their final moments, their faces twisted with terror or surprise, eternal testimony to the deadly power Medusa could no longer control. She lived among these accidental victims, these stone witnesses to her cursed existence. Imagine the psychological toll of being surrounded constantly by the evidence of deaths you had caused, even if those deaths were not intentional. Every statue was a reminder of what she had become, every frozen face an accusation that she could never answer. The basic necessities of existence became monumental challenges. How do you hunt for food when your gaze kills? How do you gather water when you cannot look at streams or pools? How do you maintain any semblance of sanity when every interaction with the living world ends in death? Medusa developed strategies born of desperate necessity. She learned to move through the world with her eyes closed or covered, relying on her other senses to navigate. She learned to hunt at night, when most creatures were asleep and less likely to look upon her face. She learned to speak to the statues that surrounded her, holding conversations with the stone remains of her victims as a way to maintain some connection to language and thought. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of her existence was the awareness of what she had lost. She remembered being beautiful, being loved, being welcomed wherever she went. She remembered the warmth of human companionship, the satisfaction of meaningful work, the security of believing herself protected by divine power. Those memories were now sources of torment rather than comfort, reminders of a life that could never be reclaimed. The transformation had not dulled her intelligence or erased her capacity for emotion. She remained fully human in mind and heart, trapped within a monstrous form that made normal life impossible. She could think, feel, remember, hope, and despair with all the intensity of her former self, but she could no longer act on any of those emotions without causing death and destruction. Sleep, when it came, offered no escape. Her dreams were filled with memories of her former life, visions of the temple she had served, faces of the priestesses who had been her companions. She would wake from these dreams to find herself once again in her desolate exile, surrounded by stone statues and the crushing weight of isolation. Time itself became meaningless in this existence. Days blended into nights, seasons passed unnoticed, years accumulated without purpose or progress. Medusa existed rather than lived, endured rather than thrived, maintained a biological presence in the world while being spiritually and emotionally dead to it. Yet she persisted. Something in her refused to surrender completely to despair, some spark of the person she had once been that would not be extinguished. Perhaps it was hope that someday the curse might be lifted. Perhaps it was simple stubbornness, a refusal to give the gods the satisfaction of seeing her utterly destroyed. Or perhaps it was something deeper, a recognition that even in her monstrous state, she was still essentially herself, still deserving of existence, even if that existence had become a torment. But Medusa was not entirely alone in her exile. Her transformation had not been unique. She had become one of three sisters, the Gorgons, united in monstrosity and bound together by shared suffering. And their story adds yet another layer of tragedy to an already devastating tale. In the ancient world, tragedy was often multiplied rather than shared. When the gods decided to punish, they rarely limited their wrath to a single victim. So it was that Medusa's transformation into a monster was not a solitary curse, but part of a larger divine punishment that created not one Gorgon, but three. Her sisters, Stheno and Euryale, had committed no crime beyond the accident of birth that made them Medusa's siblings. They had been beautiful young women, living their own lives, pursuing their own paths, when divine wrath swept over them like a plague, transforming them into monsters for the simple reason that they shared blood with someone who had displeased the gods. The ancient sources are frustratingly vague about Stheno and Euryale's lives before the transformation. Were they also priestesses? Were they married women with families of their own? Were they young girls barely out of childhood? We don't know. And perhaps that uncertainty is itself part of the tragedy. They have been reduced to footnotes in Medusa's story, their individual identities erased by the monstrous forms they were forced to assume. What we do know is that their transformations paralleled Medusa's in almost every detail. They too were given serpentine hair that writhed and hissed with malevolent life. They too developed the bronze wings that marked them as creatures of air and darkness rather than earth and light. They too were gifted with claws and fangs and voices that could drive mortals mad with terror. But there was one crucial difference. Stheno and Euryale were made immortal. While Medusa retained her mortal nature despite her monstrous transformation, her sisters were cursed to live forever in their twisted forms. This was not mercy, but the most refined form of cruelty imaginable. Medusa at least had the possibility of death, the hope that her suffering might someday end. Her sisters had no such comfort. Imagine the horror of their situation. They were condemned to spend eternity as monsters, watching the world change around them while they remained frozen in their cursed forms. They would see civilizations rise and fall, watch countless generations of humans live and die, witness the birth and death of languages, religions, and entire ways of life, all while being unable to participate in any of it, except as objects of terror. The three sisters found each other in that desolate wasteland at the edge of the world, drawn together by the shared monstrosity that had separated them from all other living beings. Their reunion, if it can be called that, was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, they were no longer completely alone. They had each other, companions who understood their suffering, sisters who could look upon them without turning to stone. But their reunion was also a constant reminder of what they had lost. Looking at each other, they saw not comfort, but reflection of their own monstrosity. Each sister's face was a mirror showing the others exactly what they had become. There could be no forgetting, no denial, no hope that perhaps the transformation had been less complete than they feared. Their relationship was complicated by the dynamics of immortality and mortality. Stheno and Euryale knew that they would have to watch Medusa age and eventually die, adding the anticipation of loss to their already overwhelming burden of suffering. Medusa, meanwhile, faced the knowledge that her death would leave her sisters even more alone than they already were. Yet despite these complications, the sisters formed a bond that transcended their monstrous nature. They developed their own language of gestures and sounds, ways of communicating that didn't require them to look directly at each other. They shared the meager sustenance they could gather in their wasteland. They comforted each other as best they could, given the limitations of their existence. Stheno, whose name meant strength, became the fierce protector of the small family. She was the most aggressive of the three, the quickest to attack any intruders who wandered into their territory. Her immortality had bred a kind of reckless courage. What was the worst that could happen to someone who could not die? Uriel, wide-wandering, was the most restless of the sisters. She would disappear for days or weeks at a time, exploring the furthest reaches of their desolate realm, or venturing toward the edges of the civilized world. Perhaps she hoped to find some escape from their curse, or perhaps movement was simply her way of dealing with the crushing weight of eternal imprisonment in a monstrous form, and Medusa remained the most human of the three, clinging to memories of her former life with a tenacity that was both admirable and heartbreaking. She would speak to her sisters of the temple, of the rituals they had performed, of the goddess they had served. She tried to maintain some semblance of the prayers and observances that had once given her life meaning, even though those gods had abandoned her. The sisters' daily existence was a study in adaptation to impossible circumstances. They learned to hunt together, using their combined abilities to trap prey without accidentally petrifying it. They learned to communicate through touch and sound, developing an intimacy that was both deeper and more limited than normal human relationships. They also learned to defend themselves. Word of the Gorgons spread throughout the ancient world, and their remote location did not protect them from visitors. Heroes seeking glory, treasure hunters drawn by legends of hoarded wealth, soldiers fleeing from battles. All manner of humans found their way to the edge of the world, and most of them had violence on their minds. The stone statues that surrounded their lair were not just accidents, but warnings. Each frozen figure told the same story. This is what happens to those who come here with hostile intent. Yet the warnings were rarely heeded. The ancient world was full of men who believed themselves clever enough or strong enough or blessed enough to succeed where others had failed. The sisters developed strategies for dealing with these intruders. They learned to work together, using their flight and their deadly gaze as coordinated weapons. They could appear suddenly from different directions, overwhelming enemies before they could react. Their very appearance was often enough to drive attackers mad with terror, making actual combat unnecessary. But each successful defense added to their burden of guilt and isolation. They were not naturally violent creatures. They had been forced into monstrosity, and now they were being forced to act the part of monsters. Every death they caused, even in self-defense, was another link in the chain that bound them to their cursed existence. The relationship between the sisters was also complicated by their shared knowledge of what had caused their transformation. They all knew that Medusa was the original target of divine wrath, that their own suffering was essentially collateral damage in a conflict they had not started and could not understand. This knowledge could have bred resentment, but instead it seemed to strengthen their bond. They were all victims of the same arbitrary divine cruelty. Years passed in this manner, then decades. The sisters aged at different rates, Medusa showing the effects of time while Stheno and Euryale remained frozen in their monstrous youth. The world beyond their wasteland continued to change and evolve, but news of it reached them only through the terrified whispers of the few humans who encountered them and lived to flee. They heard stories of wars and conquests, of the rise and fall of kings, of new gods and new heroes. They learned that their own legend was growing, that they had become figures of myth and terror, used to frighten children and warn travelers. They had become larger than life, more symbol than reality. But symbols, as they were about to learn, had a way of attracting the attention of heroes. And heroes, unlike ordinary mortals, came not to flee or hide, but to test themselves against the stuff of legend. The quiet years of exile and adaptation were coming to an end. A young man named Perseus was about to embark on a quest that would bring him to the edge of the world, armed with divine weapons and a hero's determination to achieve the impossible. He was coming to kill Medusa, and his arrival would shatter the fragile peace the sisters had built in their realm of stone and shadow. The most famous chapter of Medusa's story was about to begin, but it would also be her last. Every hero needs an impossible quest, and every impossible quest needs a monster. When the gods decided that a young man named Perseus required testing, they chose the most terrifying creature in their extensive catalog of nightmares, Medusa, whose very gaze could turn living flesh to stone. But Perseus's quest wasn't born from noble ambition or divine calling. It emerged from the messy realities of mortal politics, family drama, and the kind of boastful stupidity that seems to afflict young men across all cultures and centuries. To understand why Perseus found himself setting out to kill one of the most dangerous beings in the ancient world, we need to understand the web of relationships and rivalries that led him to that desolate shore where the Gorgons made their home. Perseus was the son of Danae, a princess of Argos, and Zeus, who had visited her in the form of a golden shower while she was imprisoned in a bronze tower by her father. Yes, even by the standards of Greek mythology, that's a strange sentence to write. Danae's father, Acrisius, had locked her away because an oracle had prophesied that her son would kill him. The imprisonment was meant to prevent her from having children, but Zeus, as usual, found a way around mortal precautions. When Perseus was born, Acrisius faced a dilemma. He couldn't bring himself to directly murder his daughter and grandson, but he also couldn't afford to keep them around given the prophecy. His solution was typically Greek in its combination of pragmatism and cowardice. He locked mother and son in a wooden chest and threw them into the sea, leaving their fate to the gods. The chest washed up on the island of Seriphos, where it was found by a fisherman named Dictys. This kindly man took in the refugee mother and child, raising Perseus as his own son. For years, they lived quietly on the island, Danae working as a weaver, and Perseus growing into a strong, intelligent young man with no knowledge of his divine heritage. The peaceful life ended when Perseus reached adulthood and attracted the attention of Polydectes, the king of Seriphos. Polydectes wanted Danae for himself, but he knew that Perseus would never allow his mother to be forced into an unwanted marriage. The king needed to get the young man out of the way, permanently if possible. Polydectes was cunning. He announced his intention to marry a different woman, and demanded wedding gifts from all the nobles of his kingdom. Each man was expected to contribute a horse, a significant expense that demonstrated their loyalty and status. Perseus, being poor, had no horse to give, a fact that exposed him to public ridicule and shame. In the midst of this humiliation, Perseus made the kind of rash declaration that heroes specialize in, and that wise men spend their lives avoiding. He proclaimed that he could bring the king any wedding gift he desired, even the head of Medusa herself. The moment those words left his mouth, Perseus realized he had made a catastrophic mistake. Polydectes accepted the offer immediately, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. He had succeeded in maneuvering the young man into an impossible position. Perseus would either die attempting to fulfill his boast, leaving Danae unprotected, or he would fail to even try, marking himself as a coward and losing all social standing. What Perseus didn't know was that his divine heritage was about to manifest itself in ways beyond his imagining. The gods, it seemed, had plans for him that went far beyond the petty politics of a small island kingdom. The first sign came from Athena herself, the same goddess who had transformed Medusa into a monster. This irony was not lost on the ancient storytellers, though they rarely commented on it directly. The goddess who had punished her own priestess for being the victim of sexual assault now appeared to help a young hero who wanted to kill that same victim. Athena's assistance came in the form of information and equipment. She told Perseus where to find the Gorgons, warned him about the deadly nature of Medusa's gaze, and provided him with a polished bronze shield that could serve as a mirror. By looking at Medusa's reflection rather than directly at her, Perseus could approach without being turned to stone. But Athena's help came with conditions and warnings, She emphasized that Perseus must kill only Medusa, not her immortal sisters. She also stressed that the head must be handled with extreme care even after death, as its power to petrify would remain intact. This wasn't a hunting expedition, it was a surgical strike that required precision, courage, and more than a little luck. The goddess also directed Perseus to seek out additional divine assistance. The Gorgons were not ordinary monsters, and defeating them would require more than mortal weapons and courage. He would need tools crafted by the gods themselves. Perseus's next stop was a visit to Hermes, the messenger god and guide to heroes. Hermes provided him with a pair of winged sandals that would allow him to fly, a sword made of adamantine that could cut through anything, and directions to find the Hesperides, nymphs who guarded treasures at the western edge of the world. The Hesperides possessed two items essential to Perseus's quest: a cap of invisibility borrowed from Hades himself, and a magical pouch called a kibisis that could safely contain Medusa's severed head without the bearer being affected by its power. But obtaining these items was itself a quest within a quest. The Hesperides would not give them up easily, and they were guarded by creatures and challenges that would test Perseus's worthiness as a hero. He had to prove himself through trials of strength, cunning, and moral character before the nymphs would entrust him with such powerful artifacts. The cap of invisibility was particularly crucial to his mission. The Gorgons were not solitary creatures, but sisters who worked together to defend their territory. Perseus would need to approach Medusa without alerting Stheno and Euryale, and invisibility would be his only chance of achieving the element of surprise. As Perseus gathered his divine equipment and prepared for the journey to the edge of the world, he must have experienced a complex mixture of emotions. There was certainly fear. He was about to attempt something that no mortal had ever survived. There was also excitement at the prospect of achieving lasting glory and proving himself worthy of his divine heritage. But there may also have been doubt, perhaps even guilt. The stories he had heard about Medusa portrayed her as a monster, a creature of pure evil that threatened all civilized life. But Perseus was intelligent enough to wonder about the origins of that monstrosity. Had Medusa always been evil, or had she been made into something terrible by forces beyond her control? These questions, if they occurred to him, were academic. Perseus had made his boast in front of the entire court of Seriphos. His honor, his mother's safety, and his own life depended on completing the quest successfully. Whatever Medusa had once been, she was now the key to his survival and his family's future. The young hero set out from Seriphos equipped with divine weapons, supernatural abilities, and the blessing of the gods themselves. He was as prepared for his task as any mortal could be. What he wasn't prepared for was the emotional complexity of what he would encounter when he finally reached the Gorgon's lair. Because the monster he was planning to kill had once been remarkably similar to himself, a young person trying to serve the gods faithfully, caught up in divine politics they couldn't understand or control, and ultimately punished for crimes they hadn't committed. The parallels between hero and monster were about to become tragically clear. The journey to the edge of the world was not a leisurely voyage, but a harrowing expedition into regions where the normal rules of geography and reality began to break down. Perseus, equipped with his divine arsenal, set out from Seriphos knowing only that he was heading west, toward the setting sun, into waters that few mortals had ever crossed and fewer still had returned from. The winged sandals given to him by Hermes were not merely convenient transportation, but instruments of divine power that allowed him to soar above the wine-dark Mediterranean like a god himself. Below him, the familiar islands of the Greek archipelago gave way to stranger waters, where sea monsters breached the surface and storms appeared and vanished without warning. Flying was itself a revelation. Perseus had spent his entire life bound to the earth, moving at the pace of human feet on familiar ground. Now he could cross vast distances in hours, watch the curve of the earth beneath him, and see patterns in the landscape that no terrestrial observer could appreciate. It was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. But the journey was not without its dangers. The further west he traveled, the more unstable the boundary between the mortal and divine worlds became. He passed through regions where the air itself seemed thick with magic, where islands appeared and disappeared based on the observer's state of mind, and where the very concept of direction became fluid and unreliable. Perseus learned to navigate by more than conventional landmarks. He followed the guidance of stars that shone in patterns unknown to earthbound astronomers. He watched for signs and omens that would indicate his approach to the Gorgon's realm. Flocks of birds flying in unnatural formations, clouds that cast shadows darker than any natural weather, and an increasing stillness in the air that suggested proximity to something that even nature feared to disturb. The psychological challenges of the journey were as difficult as the physical ones. Perseus was flying toward almost certain death, armed with untested weapons and abilities he had never used in actual combat. The weight of his mission pressed down on him like a physical burden. Every mile he traveled was a mile closer to the moment when he would have to face one of the most terrifying creatures ever imagined. He had time to think during those long hours of flight, and his thoughts were not always comfortable. The stories he had heard about Medusa were filled with contradictions and gaps that became more troubling the more he considered them. Some tales painted her as an ancient evil that had always existed to threaten mortal life. Others suggested she had once been something different, something that had been changed rather than born into monstrosity. The question that haunted him was simple but profound. What right did he have to take her life? Perseus was embarking on this quest not to protect innocent people or uphold justice, but to fulfill a boastful promise made in a moment of youthful pride. He was planning to kill a creature who, as far as he knew, had never personally harmed him or anyone he cared about. But these moral complexities were overshadowed by practical necessities. Perseus had committed himself to this path, and there was no honorable way to withdraw. His mother's safety depended on his success, and his own reputation would be destroyed if he returned empty-handed. Right or wrong, he had to see the quest through to its conclusion. As he approached the edge of the known world, the landscape beneath him began to change in disturbing ways. The blue waters of the Mediterranean faded into something darker and more ominous, a sea that reflected no light and seemed to absorb the illumination of the sun itself. Islands appeared that had no names, their shores lined with rocks that looked suspiciously like the fossilized remains of creatures too large to have ever existed naturally. The air grew cold despite the continued presence of sunlight, and Perseus found himself pulling his cloak closer around his shoulders. The winged sandals that had carried him so effortlessly across the familiar waters now seemed to struggle against invisible currents and opposing forces that made flight more difficult with each passing hour. He began to see evidence of the Gorgons' presence long before he reached their actual lair. Ships drifted empty on the dark waters, their crews nowhere to be seen but their sails still set as if they had been abandoned in the middle of routine sailing. Perseus landed on one of these ghost ships and found it filled with stone statues, sailors caught in the act of working the rigging, their faces frozen in expressions of shock and terror. These were not ancient relics but recent victims. The stone was fresh, unmarked by weather or time. Perseus realized he was looking at men who had encountered the Gorgons within the last few weeks or months, transformed into art by a glance from eyes that turned life into death. The discovery filled him with a mixture of fear and determination. Fear, because it drove home the reality of what he was facing. These had been experienced sailors, men who knew the sea and its dangers, and they had been helpless against the creature he was planning to hunt. Determination, because each statue represented an innocent life cut short, a family somewhere that would never know what had happened to their loved one. Perseus continued his journey with renewed purpose, but also with a growing sense of unease. The ghost ships were scattered across several miles of ocean, suggesting that the Gorgons' influence extended far beyond their immediate territory. He might encounter Medusa long before he expected to, and in circumstances where he wasn't prepared for combat. The landscape continued to grow more desolate and threatening. Islands appeared that were nothing but bare rock, twisted into shapes that hurt the eyes to look upon. The water itself seemed contaminated, thick and viscous in a way that defied natural explanation. Seabirds that approached these waters fell dead from the sky, their bodies sinking without a trace into the dark depths. Finally, as the sun began to set on what Perseus hoped would not be his last day of life, he saw it. A large island shrouded in perpetual mist, its shores lined with what looked like white marble sculptures, but which he now knew were the petrified remains of countless visitors. This was the realm of the Gorgons, the place where beauty had been transformed into horror, and where he would either achieve immortal glory or join the ranks of the stone statues that served as decorations for a monster's lair. Perseus landed on a smaller island several miles away from the Gorgons' stronghold, needing time to prepare himself mentally and tactically for what was to come. He checked his equipment obsessively, the mirrored shield that would allow him to see Medusa without looking at her directly, the adamantine sword that could cut through anything, the cap of invisibility that would hide him from the other Gorgons, and the magical pouch that would contain Medusa's head after he severed it. Everything was ready except for Perseus himself. He was about to attempt something that no hero had ever achieved, armed with weapons that had never been tested against such a foe. He was young, inexperienced in real combat, and thousands of miles from any help or support. But he was also the son of Zeus, trained by Athena, and equipped with tools forged by gods. If anyone could accomplish this impossible task, it was him. As darkness fell over the wine-dark sea, Perseus prepared to make his final approach to the island where three sisters waited in their realm of stone and shadow, unaware that their long exile was about to come to a sudden and violent end. The hunt was about to become a confrontation, and one way or another dawn would bring an ending to a story that had begun with a crime in a temple and would conclude with blood on a beach at the edge of the world. Dawn came gray and muted to the island of the Gorgons, filtered through mists that never seemed to clear and clouds that moved against the wind. Perseus, hidden on his observation post several miles away, watched the sun struggle to penetrate the unnatural atmosphere that surrounded his target. Even the light seemed afraid to touch that cursed shore. He had spent the night in restless preparation, checking and rechecking his equipment, rehearsing his approach, and trying to calm the fear that threatened to overwhelm his determination. This was not the clean fear of battle, where adrenaline could be channeled into action, but the cold dread of approaching something that defied all natural law and human understanding. The plan was simple in concept, terrifyingly complex in execution. Perseus would use the cap of invisibility to approach the Gorgon's lair without being detected. He would locate Medusa among her sisters, using the mirrored shield to observe her without making direct eye contact. When the moment was right, he would strike with the adamantine sword, severing her head in a single blow. The magical pouch would contain the head safely, and he would escape before Stheno and Euryale could react to their sister's death. Simple, except that every aspect of the plan required perfect timing, flawless execution, and an enormous amount of luck. One mistake, one moment of hesitation or clumsiness, and Perseus would join the stone army that decorated the Gorgons' island. As the morning progressed, Perseus observed the island through a bronze telescope provided by Hermes, studying the terrain and trying to understand the layout of his target. What he saw was both more and less than he had expected. The island was larger than it had appeared from a distance, perhaps 10 miles across and 5 miles wide. But most of it was barren wasteland, twisted rock formations and dead soil that supported no vegetation. The only area that showed signs of habitation was a valley near the center of the island, sheltered by high cliffs and accessible only through a narrow pass. It was in this valley that the Gorgons had made their home, and it was here that Perseus could see the evidence of their cursed existence. Stone statues filled the valley like a macabre garden, hundreds of figures frozen in their final moments. Warriors with weapons raised, sailors clutching ropes and rigging, travelers with their hands extended in gestures of peace or supplication. Each statue told a story of a life cut short by an accidental glimpse of death itself. And moving among these stone monuments were the Gorgons themselves. Perseus's first sight of them through the telescope was a shock that nearly made him drop the instrument. Nothing had prepared him for the reality of their appearance, the way they moved, the sheer wrongness of their existence. They were clearly female in form, but female transformed into something that violated every natural law. Their hair writhed and twisted with serpentine life, hundreds of snakes where human locks should have been. Their skin was scaled and reptilian, gleaming with an oily sheen that reflected light in nauseating patterns. They moved with a fluid grace that was beautiful and horrible in equal measure, their bronze wings folding and unfolding as they walked among their stone victims. But it was their faces that truly disturbed him. Even through the telescope and mirrored shield, Perseus could see that they retained enough human features to be recognizable as what they had once been. These were not alien monsters, but transformed women, creatures that remembered humanity even as they embodied its antithesis. Perseus spent hours observing their movements, trying to distinguish one sister from another and identify which was Medusa. The ancient sources had told him that she was mortal while her sisters were immortal. But from a distance, all three appeared equally monstrous and equally dangerous. Finally, as the afternoon wore on, he noticed a subtle difference in their behavior. Two of the Gorgons seemed more aggressive, more alert to potential threats. They patrolled the perimeter of the valley, checking the approaches and examining any new additions to their statue collection. The third remained closer to the center of the valley, moving more slowly, her posture suggesting sadness rather than rage. This, Perseus realized, must be Medusa. While her sisters had adapted to their monstrous existence with fierce aggression, she retained something of her original nature, the melancholy of someone who remembered what she had lost. The realization troubled him more than he cared to admit. It was easier to kill a monster than to kill someone who was still essentially human, despite her transformed appearance. But Perseus pushed these thoughts aside. He had come too far and risked too much to allow sentiment to interfere with necessity. As evening approached, Perseus made his final preparations. He donned the cap of invisibility, secured the mirrored shield to his arm, and drew the adamantine sword. The magical pouch hung at his side, ready to receive its grisly prize. He was as ready as mortal preparation could make him. The flight to the island was the longest few minutes of Perseus's life. Even invisible, he felt exposed and vulnerable. The Gorgons might not be able to see him, but they had other senses that could detect his presence. He flew high and approached from an unexpected angle, landing silently on the cliffs above the valley. From this vantage point, he could look down into the Gorgons' realm and observe their evening activities. Stheno and Euryale were settling down for the night, arranging themselves among the statues like guardians watching over their stone flock. Medusa remained apart from her sisters, sitting alone on a rocky outcropping and staring out toward the sea. There was something profoundly sad about her posture, Perseus realized. She looked like someone waiting for something that would never come, hoping for rescue or redemption that was forever beyond her reach. For a moment he hesitated, struck by the tragedy of what he was about to do. But the moment passed. Perseus began his descent into the valley, moving with exaggerated care to avoid disturbing even the smallest pebble. The cap of invisibility hid him from sight, but it couldn't muffle sound or eliminate his physical presence entirely. If he bumped into a statue or stepped on loose rock, the noise would alert all three Gorgons to his presence. The journey down into the valley took nearly an hour. Perseus had to pause frequently, waiting for the sisters to look away or move to different positions. Several times he came within arm's reach of Stheno or Euryale, close enough to see the individual scales on their skin and hear the soft hissing of their serpentine hair. Finally, he reached the rocky outcropping where Medusa sat alone. She was even more tragic up close than she had appeared from a distance. Her monstrous features couldn't entirely hide the remnants of the beauty she had once possessed, the facial structure that had made her famous throughout the ancient world. Perseus positioned himself behind her, raised the mirrored shield to observe her reflection, and lifted the adamantine sword. He had one chance to do this correctly. The blade had to sever her neck completely in a single stroke, or her dying screams would alert her sisters and turn his mission into a three-way battle he could never win. He could see Medusa's face clearly in the shield's polished surface, and what he saw there nearly stopped him from completing his task. She wasn't the snarling monster he had expected, but a woman trapped in a monstrous form, her expression filled with a sadness so profound it seemed to encompass all the suffering in the world. but Perseus was a hero, trained to put duty before emotion and mission before mercy. With a swift, sure stroke, he brought the adamantine sword down on Medusa's neck. The blade passed through flesh and bone as if they were water. Medusa's head separated from her body instantly, her serpentine hair still writhing as blood fountained from the severed neck. Perseus caught the head in the magical pouch without looking at it directly, sealing away the gaze that could turn flesh to stone. But Medusa's death was not silent. The impact of the sword's stroke sent vibrations through the rocky outcropping, and the thud of her headless body hitting the ground echoed across the valley like thunder. Stheno and Euryale were alert immediately, their heads snapping up as they searched for the source of the disturbance. They saw their sister's headless corpse and let out screams of rage and grief that seemed to shake the very foundations of the island. Perseus was already in motion, the winged sandals carrying him up and away from the valley as the two immortal Gorgons launched themselves into the air in pursuit. They couldn't see him, but they could track his movement by the disturbance he created in the air and the sound of the sandals' wings. The chase that followed was a nightmare of speed and desperation. Stheno and Euryale flew faster than Perseus had thought possible, their bronze wings cutting through the air like blades. They shrieked curses and threats, their voices carrying clearly across the water as Perseus fled toward the edge of their territory. But the head start and the winged sandals were enough. As Perseus crossed the boundary of the dark waters surrounding the Gorgons' island, he felt the pursuit slacken. The sisters couldn't follow him into the broader Mediterranean without abandoning their realm and their sister's body. Perseus was free, victorious, and alive. He had accomplished the impossible, acquired the prize that would secure his mother's safety and his own reputation. The head of Medusa was safely contained in the magical pouch, its power waiting to be unleashed on his enemies. But as he flew away from the island of the Gorgons, Perseus found that victory tasted more like ashes than glory. He had killed a monster, yes, but he had also killed a woman who had never personally wronged him, someone who had been transformed into monstrosity through no fault of her own. Behind him on the dark island, two immortal sisters mourned the death of their mortal sibling, and the ancient world had lost one of its most terrifying and tragic figures. Medusa was dead, but her story was far from over. The head that Perseus carried would become a weapon of incredible power, and from her death would spring creatures and legends that would outlive the civilization that had created them. Death, it seemed, was just another transformation for the woman who had already been changed so completely that she barely resembled what she had once been. In Greek mythology, death is rarely the end of the story, but often its most dramatic transformation. So it was with Medusa, whose mortal end became the beginning of new and wondrous life. As Perseus flew away from the Gorgons' island with his terrible prize, the severed body he left behind was already giving birth to creatures that would reshape the mythology of the ancient world. From Medusa's spilled blood, where it touched the rocky ground of the cursed island, sprang two beings that embodied different aspects of divine power and beauty. The first was Pegasus, the winged horse whose name would become synonymous with poetry, inspiration, and the soaring flight of human imagination. The second was Chrysaor, a giant warrior whose golden sword would make him a figure of awe and terror in his own right. The birth of these creatures was not natural reproduction, but divine creation, the result of Medusa's unique nature and the circumstances of her death. During her time as a priestess of Athena, before her transformation, she had been beloved by Poseidon, and the god of the sea had left his mark upon her. The children born from her death were thus Poseidon's offspring, conceived in violence but born from divine blood mixed with mortal earth. Pegasus emerged first, his white wings unfurling as he took his first breath of mortal air. He was perfectly formed, a creature of impossible beauty and grace, his equine body gleaming like polished marble and his wings spanning twice the length of his body. But he was more than just a beautiful animal. Pegasus was inspiration made flesh, the physical embodiment of the creative force that drives poets and artists to reach beyond the mundane world toward something transcendent. The ancient Greeks understood that inspiration was not a gentle gift, but a wild force that could uplift or destroy those who encountered it. Pegasus reflected this duality. He was gentle and magnificent, but he was also untamable by ordinary means. Only heroes of exceptional virtue and wisdom could hope to ride him, and even they could do so only when it served some greater purpose. Chrysaor's emergence was more violent and dramatic. Where Pegasus had simply stepped forth from his mother's blood as if emerging from a divine womb, Chrysaor burst into existence fully armed and ready for battle. His name meant golden sword, and he carried that weapon from the moment of his birth, a blade that gleamed with its own inner light and could cut through any armor or shield. Unlike Pegasus, who would become known for his beauty and association with peaceful arts, Chrysaor was a warrior from the first moment of his existence. He was tall as a giant, strong as a titan, and filled with the kind of divine rage that could level mountains and redirect rivers. He was Poseidon's vengeance made manifest, the god's fury at the treatment of his beloved priestess given physical form and terrible purpose. The birth of these two creatures from Medusa's death body was both a vindication and a tragedy. It proved that she had not been the evil monster her transformation had made her appear, but a woman who carried within her the seeds of beauty and strength. Her children were magnificent, divine, untouched by the curse that had made her appearance so terrible, but it also meant that her death was necessary for their birth. Medusa could not give life while she possessed the power to take it. The curse that had made her gaze deadly had also prevented her from experiencing the joy of motherhood during her lifetime. Only in death could she fulfill this most fundamental aspect of her original nature. The irony was bitter and profound. Medusa, who had been punished for being the victim of sexual violence, could only become a mother through her own violent death. The priestess who had dedicated her life to serving a virgin goddess found her only legacy in children born from blood and earth rather than love and choice. Pegasus's first act upon his birth was to take flight, soaring up from the cursed island toward the heavens as if seeking to escape the tragedy of his origin. His wings carried him across the Mediterranean in great sweeping arcs, and everywhere he passed, his presence seemed to cleanse the air of malevolent influences. Sailors who spotted him flying overhead reported that storms calmed, winds became favorable, and their vessels moved with supernatural speed toward their destinations. The winged horse eventually made his way to Mount Helicon, the sacred mountain of the Muses, where his hoofbeats struck the rock and created the spring Hippocrene. This spring became known as the fountain of poetic inspiration, its waters sought by writers and artists who hoped to drink from the same source that had given birth to the greatest works of literature and art. But Pegasus was no ordinary mount, to be tamed by any rider who desired him. He remained wild and free, appearing only to heroes whose quests served higher purposes than personal glory. The most famous of these was Bellerophon, who rode Pegasus in his battle against the Chimera, another monster born from divine mating and divine curse. Chrysaor's path was darker and more complex. Where Pegasus embodied the uplifting aspects of divine power, Chrysaor represented its terrible justice. He became a giant among giants, a warrior whose very presence on a battlefield could turn the tide of conflicts between nations. His golden sword was said to burn with the light of the sun, and armies would flee at the mere sight of it gleaming on the horizon. Unlike his winged brother, Chrysaor did not seek solitude or artistic pursuits. He involved himself directly in the affairs of mortals, appearing at moments of great crisis to tip the balance between justice and injustice. He became a figure of legend among warriors, a divine champion who could not be defeated by mortal weapons or earthly strategies. Some accounts suggest that Chrysaor eventually settled in the far west, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, where he founded a kingdom of giants and ruled with wisdom and terrible power. Others claim that he never died, but continues to wander the earth, appearing whenever tyranny threatens to overwhelm justice and the innocent require a champion beyond mortal capability. The birth of these two creatures from Medusa's death also served to complicate the narrative surrounding her transformation and death. If she had truly been nothing more than a monster, how could her death have given birth to such magnificent beings? If she had been entirely evil, how could Pegasus, the embodiment of artistic inspiration and beauty, have emerged from her blood? The ancient Greeks understood this contradiction and used it to add depth to their mythology. Medusa's story became not just a tale of monster-slaying heroism, but a complex meditation on the nature of justice, transformation, and redemption. Her death was both tragedy and triumph, both ending and beginning. Perseus, flying away from the scene of his victory, was unaware of the miraculous births that had followed his departure. He carried Medusa's head in its magical container, not knowing that he had also inadvertently become responsible for bringing two new divine beings into the world. His act of heroism had consequences beyond his understanding or intention. The head itself retained all of its deadly power, even in death. The magical pouch that contained it grew heavy with more than physical weight, as if the severed head was still aware, still capable of the terrible transformations that had marked Medusa's cursed existence. Perseus found himself flying more slowly, not from fatigue but from the supernatural burden he carried. As he made his way back toward the civilized world, Perseus began to understand that killing Medusa had not ended her story, but transformed it into something even more complex and far-reaching. The head in his possession was not just a trophy, but a weapon of incredible power, and the blood that had spilled from her severed neck had already begun to reshape the mythological landscape of the ancient world. Behind him, on the cursed island, Stheno and Euryale mourned their sister's death while marveling at the creatures that had emerged from it. For the first time since their transformation, they felt something other than rage and despair. The birth of Pegasus and Chrysaor suggested that their suffering might have served some larger purpose, that even divine cruelty could sometimes give birth to divine beauty. Medusa was dead, but her legacy was only beginning. The head that Perseus carried would become one of the most powerful weapons in Greek mythology, used to defeat monsters and tyrants, to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. And the children born from her death would inspire countless tales of heroism, artistry, and divine justice. The priestess who had begun her story as a victim of divine violence had ended it as the mother of legends, the source of powers that would outlive the civilization that had created them. Death had not diminished her importance, but had transformed it into something eternal and magnificent. Her story was far from over. Death had not diminished Medusa's power, but had concentrated it, refined it, and made it portable. The severed head that Perseus carried in his magical pouch retained all of the terrible capabilities that had made her the most feared creature in the ancient world. But now, those powers served the purposes of heroes rather than the isolation of a cursed exile. The first test of the head's continued potency came during Perseus's journey home from the Gorgons' island. As he flew across the unfamiliar waters of the far western Mediterranean, he encountered Cetus, a massive sea monster that had been terrorizing the coastal regions of Ethiopia. The creature was enormous, its serpentine body stretching for hundreds of yards beneath the dark water, its head rising above the waves like a living mountain crowned with teeth. Cetus had been ravaging the coastline for months, destroying ships, devouring crews, and making maritime trade impossible. The creature was so large and powerful that conventional weapons had proven useless against it. Armies had tried to drive it away with volleys of spears and arrows, but such attacks were like raindrops against a mountainside. Perseus, exhausted from his encounter with the Gorgons and eager to test his newly acquired weapon, descended toward the monster. From a safe distance, he removed Medusa's head from its protective container and held it so that the creature could see the dead Gorgon's face. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. Cetus, in the middle of surfacing to attack what it perceived as another small flying creature, suddenly stopped moving entirely. Its massive body, which had been cutting through the water with fluid grace, became as still and solid as granite. The sea monster had been transformed into a stone island, its petrified form creating a new landmark that would be known to sailors for generations. The transformation was so complete that even the water immediately surrounding Cetus turned to stone, creating a rough circle of solid rock where there had been liquid sea. Fish swimming near the monster were caught in the petrification effect, becoming fossil decorations embedded in the newly created stone formation. Perseus was amazed by the weapon's power, but also disturbed by its indiscriminate nature. The head had turned not just the target monster to stone, but everything in its immediate vicinity. He realized that wielding Medusa's head would require extraordinary care and precision. This was not a sword that could be drawn casually or used in close combat without risking the safety of allies and innocent bystanders. The incident with Cetus also taught Perseus something important about the psychology of his weapon. The head retained not just Medusa's deadly gaze, but something of her awareness as well. When he held it, he could feel a presence within it, a consciousness that was both alien and familiar. It was as if Medusa's spirit remained trapped within her severed head, aware of what was happening around her but powerless to communicate or control her circumstances. This realization troubled Perseus more than he cared to admit. He had thought that killing Medusa would end her suffering, but it seemed that death had only transformed her torment into a different kind of imprisonment. She was now forced to serve as a weapon for others, her deadly gaze used for purposes she might not approve of, her consciousness trapped within a severed head that could never rest or find peace. As Perseus continued his journey homeward, he encountered other opportunities to test his weapon's capabilities. Pirates who attempted to rob him were turned to stone when he revealed the head. A group of bandits who attacked him on a remote island became a sculpture garden of frozen aggression. Each use of the weapon was perfectly effective, but Perseus found himself growing increasingly uncomfortable with the ease of these victories. There was no skill involved in using Medusa's head, no test of courage or strength or wisdom. The weapon was so powerful that it made him invincible, but it also made him feel like he was cheating somehow, achieving victories through divine power rather than heroic virtue. The head solved problems too easily, removing the challenge and growth that were supposed to be essential parts of the heroic journey. More troubling still was the way the weapon affected his relationship with other people. Word of Perseus's new capability spread quickly through the networks of travelers, merchants, and sailors who carried news across the ancient world. People began to treat him differently, with a mixture of awe and terror that made normal human interaction impossible. When Perseus stopped at ports to resupply or rest, he found that entire communities would empty out at news of his arrival. Innkeepers would leave food and supplies outside their establishments rather than risk face-to-face encounters. Children would be hustled indoors by parents who feared that even being near someone who carried such a weapon might somehow attract its deadly power. The isolation that surrounded Perseus was different from the isolation that had tormented Medusa during her exile. But it was isolation nonetheless. He was cut off from normal human society by the very weapon that was supposed to secure his place as a celebrated hero. The head that granted him incredible power also marked him as someone too dangerous for casual companionship. Perseus began to understand, in a small way, what Medusa's existence had been like during her years of exile. The inability to have normal relationships, the constant awareness that his presence brought fear rather than comfort, the knowledge that he was fundamentally separated from the human community he was supposed to protect. All of these burdens now rested on his shoulders as well. But unlike Medusa, Perseus had chosen this burden. He could, in theory, dispose of the head and return to a normal life. The fact that he chose not to do so, that he continued to carry and use the weapon despite its psychological costs, revealed something important about the nature of power and the choices that heroes make. The most significant use of Medusa's head came when Perseus finally returned to Seriphos and confronted Polydectes, the king who had manipulated him into undertaking the quest in the first place. Perseus found that in his absence, Polydectes had indeed forced his mother Danae into marriage, using threats and political pressure to overcome her resistance. The confrontation between Perseus and Polydectes was not a battle but an execution. Perseus entered the royal palace during a feast celebrating the king's marriage, stood before the assembled court, and simply revealed Medusa's head. Polydectes and his supporters were turned to stone instantly, their expressions of shock and terror preserved forever in cold marble. The use of the weapon in this context felt like justice to Perseus. These men had acted without honor, had threatened his family, and had violated the most basic codes of hospitality and decency. Their transformation into stone seemed like an appropriate punishment for their stone-hearted behavior. But the ease of the victory also troubled him. There had been no chance for Polydectes to repent, no opportunity for mercy or redemption, no dramatic confrontation where virtue triumphed through struggle and sacrifice. The head had simply ended the conflict in an instant, removing all complexity and reducing a political crisis to a supernatural execution. Perseus began to realize that Medusa's head was not just a weapon, but a responsibility that would shape the rest of his life. He could not use it casually or carelessly, and he could not abandon it without potentially allowing it to fall into the wrong hands. He was bound to it as surely as it was bound to him, committed to carrying both its power and its psychological burdens until he could find a way to dispose of it safely. The head that had once belonged to a woman punished for being the victim of divine violence had become a symbol of ultimate power and ultimate responsibility. In death, Medusa continued to transform the lives of those who encountered her, forcing them to grapple with questions of justice, mercy, and the proper use of overwhelming force. Her gaze still turned flesh to stone, but now it also turned heroes into something more complex and morally ambiguous than the simple champions of virtue they had set out to become. Few figures from ancient mythology have proven as enduring or as adaptable as Medusa. Her story has been retold, reimagined, and reinterpreted across 3 millennia of human culture, each generation finding new meanings in the tale of the beautiful priestess who became a monster and the monster who became a symbol. The ancient Greeks themselves were not content with a single version of Medusa's story. Even in antiquity, her myth existed in multiple variants, each emphasizing different aspects of her transformation and death. Some versions portrayed her as an ancient evil that had always existed to threaten mortal life. Others, particularly those from later periods, began to emphasize her role as a victim of divine injustice. The visual representation of Medusa evolved significantly even within the classical period. Early depictions showed her as genuinely monstrous, with a face that was more beast than woman, tusks instead of teeth, and hair that was clearly serpentine rather than human. These images were meant to inspire terror and revulsion, to serve as warnings about the consequences of divine displeasure. But as Greek art became more sophisticated and psychologically complex, representations of Medusa began to change. Artists began to portray her with recognizably human features, beautiful even in their distortion. The serpents in her hair became more elegant, more decorative than horrifying. Her face, while still deadly, conveyed sadness and tragedy rather than pure malevolence. This evolution in artistic representation reflected a growing understanding of Medusa as a tragic figure rather than a simple monster. The Greeks, with their complex understanding of fate, justice, and divine caprice, began to see in her story a reflection of their own anxieties about the arbitrary nature of divine punishment and the vulnerability of mortals to forces beyond their control. Roman culture inherited the Greek fascination with Medusa, but transformed it according to their own values and concerns. Roman artists and writers were less interested in the theological implications of her story and more focused on its political and military applications. Medusa's head became a symbol of protective power, used on shields, armor, and public buildings to ward off enemies and evil influences. The Romans also began to explore the psychological dimensions of Medusa's story in ways that the Greeks had only hinted at. Roman poets like Ovid wrote about her transformation with explicit sympathy, portraying her as an innocent victim of divine politics rather than a justly punished sinner. This interpretation would prove influential for later European literature and art. During the medieval period, Medusa's story underwent another significant transformation. Christian interpreters, uncomfortable with the polytheistic elements of Greek mythology but fascinated by its symbolic potential, began to read her tale as an allegory about the dangers of vanity, the corruption of beauty, and the necessity of divine judgment. Medieval artists often portrayed Medusa in the context of religious art, using her image to represent sin, temptation, or the fallen nature of humanity. Her serpentine hair was interpreted as a symbol of the devil's influence, and her deadly gaze became a metaphor for the spiritual death that resulted from turning away from God. But even in this Christian context, there were hints of the more sympathetic interpretation that would emerge during the Renaissance. Some medieval writers began to suggest that Medusa's transformation was not entirely just, that she represented the tragic consequences of living in a fallen world where innocence was no protection against suffering. The Renaissance brought a renewed interest in classical mythology and a more nuanced understanding of its psychological and artistic possibilities. Renaissance artists like Caravaggio and Cellini created stunning representations of Medusa that emphasized both her beauty and her horror, her humanity and her monstrosity. Leonardo da Vinci painted a lost work depicting Medusa's head that was said to be so realistic and terrifying that viewers would recoil from it as if they were looking at the actual Gorgon. This painting represented a new understanding of art's power to evoke psychological responses, to make myth feel immediate and personal, rather than distant and abstract. Renaissance writers began to explore Medusa's story as a metaphor for the artist's relationship with beauty and terror, creation and destruction. They saw in her tale a reflection of their own struggles to create works that were both beautiful and meaningful, that could inspire and disturb, that could transform viewers while remaining true to their artistic vision. The Romantic period of the 18th and 19th centuries brought yet another transformation in the understanding of Medusa's story. Romantic poets and artists were fascinated by themes of isolation, alienation, and the tragic hero, and they found in Medusa a perfect symbol for their own artistic and existential concerns. Percy Bysshe Shelley wrote a poem called On the Medusa of Leonardo da Vinci that portrayed her as a figure of tragic beauty, yet it is less the horror than the grace which turns the gazer's spirit into stone. This interpretation emphasized Medusa's continued humanity despite her monstrous transformation, suggesting that her tragedy lay not in becoming a monster, but in being perceived as one. The 19th century also saw the emergence of psychological interpretations of Medusa's story. Early psychologists and anthropologists began to analyze her tale as a reflection of deep-seated human fears and desires, particularly those related to female sexuality, maternal power, and the fear of castration or emasculation. These interpretations would prove influential for 20th century thought, particularly the work of Sigmund Freud, who saw in Medusa's head a symbol of the female genitalia and the terror that they supposedly inspired in men. While Freud's specific interpretation has been largely rejected by contemporary scholars, his insight that Medusa's story reflected deep psychological anxieties has remained influential. The 20th century brought an explosion of new interpretations and adaptations of Medusa's story. Feminist scholars began to reclaim her narrative, reading it as a story about the victimization of women and the way that patriarchal society transforms female victims into scapegoats and monsters. Writers like Hélène Cixous argued that Medusa represented the power of feminine creativity, and that her story had been distorted by male-dominated culture to suppress and demonize female strength. This interpretation portrayed Perseus not as a hero, but as an agent of patriarchal oppression, and Medusa not as a monster, but as a powerful woman who had been demonized for refusing to submit to male authority. Contemporary art has embraced this reinterpretation, with artists creating works that portray Medusa as beautiful, powerful, and tragic, rather than monstrous. These modern representations often emphasize her serpentine hair as a crown rather than a curse, her gaze as penetrating wisdom rather than deadly power. Popular culture has also embraced Medusa, though often in ways that flatten her complex mythology into simple horror or action-adventure narratives. Movies, television shows, and video games frequently feature Medusa or Medusa-like creatures as antagonists to be defeated by heroic protagonists, but these adaptations rarely explore the deeper psychological and social implications of her story. Perhaps most significantly, Medusa has become a symbol of survival and transformation for contemporary women, particularly those who have experienced sexual violence or other forms of trauma. Her image appears on everything from jewelry to tattoos to protest signs, representing the power to transform victimhood into strength, suffering into wisdom, and vulnerability into protective power. This modern interpretation of Medusa represents a complete reversal of the ancient understanding of her story, Where the Greeks saw her as a cautionary tale about divine justice and the consequences of transgression, contemporary culture often sees her as an inspirational figure who represents resilience, transformation, and the power to reclaim one's narrative from those who would define it. The evolution of Medusa's story across 3 millennia of human culture reveals something important about the way mythology functions in human society. These ancient stories are not fixed texts, but living narratives that each generation adapts to address its own concerns, fears, and aspirations. Medusa's enduring power lies not in any single interpretation of her story, but in its capacity to speak to fundamental human experiences: the fear of transformation, the search for justice, the struggle against arbitrary power, and the desire to find meaning in suffering. Her tale continues to resonate because it addresses questions that every human culture must confront. In our own time, as we grapple with issues of sexual violence, institutional injustice, and the abuse of power, Medusa's story feels more relevant than ever. She remains what she has always been: a mirror in which we see our own fears, hopes, and struggles reflected back at us in mythological form. The priestess who became a monster, the victim who became a weapon, the woman who became a symbol. Medusa's transformations continue as each new generation discovers in her story the meanings that speak most powerfully to their own historical moment. The 20th and 21st centuries have brought a revolutionary re-examination of Medusa's story, one that has fundamentally challenged traditional interpretations and revealed layers of meaning that previous generations either couldn't see or chose to ignore. At the center of this reinterpretation is a simple but profound question: what if Medusa was never the villain of her own story? Feminist scholars beginning in the 1970s started to read Greek mythology through a different lens, one that was sensitive to the ways that ancient patriarchal societies constructed narratives to justify and perpetuate male dominance. What they found in Medusa's story was not a tale of heroism triumphing over monstrosity, but a deeply disturbing narrative about how women who are victimized by powerful men are then blamed, punished, and ultimately destroyed for their victimization. The key insight that transformed scholarly understanding of Medusa was the recognition that her transformation into a monster was not a just punishment for wrongdoing, but a secondary victimization that compounded the original crime committed against her. Poseidon's assault on Medusa in Athena's temple was not just sexual violence but a violation of the most sacred space in Athens, committed against a woman who had dedicated her life to serving the gods. Athena's response to this crime reveals the twisted logic of victim blaming that feminists argue still operates in contemporary society. Rather than punishing Poseidon for violating her temple and her priestess, Athena chose to punish Medusa for allowing herself to be violated. The goddess's reasoning that Medusa's presence during the assault had contaminated the holy space placed responsibility for the crime on the victim rather than the perpetrator. This interpretation transforms the entire moral framework of Medusa's story. Perseus becomes not a hero who slayed a monster, but a tool of patriarchal oppression who completed the destruction of a woman who had already been devastated by divine injustice. His quest, motivated by boastful pride rather than noble purpose, represents the way that male ego and social expectations can drive men to commit violence against women who pose no actual threat to them. The feminist reinterpretation also examines the symbolic meaning of Medusa's transformation itself. Her serpentine hair, traditionally read as a sign of her monstrous nature, can instead be understood as a symbol of feminine power and wisdom. In many ancient cultures, snakes were associated with female deities, fertility, and sacred knowledge. Athena's transformation of Medusa's hair into snakes might represent not demonization, but the goddess's unconscious recognition of her priestess's true power. The deadly gaze that made Medusa so feared takes on new meaning in this context as well. Rather than being a curse, it becomes a form of protection, perhaps the only protection available to a woman who had been so thoroughly failed by the institutions that were supposed to keep her safe. Her ability to turn others to stone can be read as a metaphor for the way that trauma can create emotional barriers that keep others at a distance, or as a symbol of the power that comes from refusing to be victimized again. French feminist theorist Hélène Cixous wrote influentially about Medusa in her essay, The Laugh of the Medusa, arguing that the Gorgon represented the suppressed power of feminine creativity and sexuality. Cixous suggested that patriarchal culture had deliberately created the myth of Medusa's terrifying appearance to prevent both men and women from recognizing the true source of female power. "You only have to look at the Medusa straight on to see her," Cixous wrote, "and she's not deadly, she's beautiful, and she's laughing." This interpretation completely inverts the traditional understanding of Medusa's story, suggesting that her supposed monstrosity was a lie created by those who feared her true nature. Contemporary feminist artists have embraced this reinterpretation, creating works that portray Medusa as beautiful, powerful, and divine rather than monstrous. These representations often emphasize her serpentine hair as a crown of wisdom rather than a mark of curse, and her gaze as penetrating insight rather than deadly power. The feminist reclamation of Medusa has also been embraced by survivors of sexual violence, who see in her story a reflection of their own experiences with institutional betrayal and victim blaming. The hashtag #TajerMeToo movement has frequently used Medusa imagery to represent the power that comes from speaking truth about sexual assault, even when that truth is uncomfortable or threatening to established power structures. This contemporary interpretation suggests that Medusa's ability to turn others to stone represents the discomfort that powerful people feel when confronted with the reality of sexual violence. Her gaze forces viewers to confront truths they would rather ignore, and the petrification that results symbolizes the paralysis that often accompanies such confrontations. However, the feminist reinterpretation of Medusa's story is not without its complexities and controversies. Some scholars argue that reading ancient myths through contemporary political frameworks risks distorting their original cultural meanings and imposing modern concepts onto societies that understood gender, power, and justice in fundamentally different ways. Critics also point out that while the feminist interpretation offers a more sympathetic reading of Medusa's character, it may actually diminish her power by transforming her from a figure of genuine terror and supernatural capability into a victim whose monstrosity was merely a social construction. There is something to be said for narratives that acknowledge the reality of female rage and power, even when that power takes forms that society finds disturbing or threatening. The question of whether Medusa should be understood as victim or monster also raises broader questions about how we interpret mythological figures who embody both tragic and terrifying qualities. The ancient Greeks were comfortable with characters who were simultaneously sympathetic and dangerous, beautiful and horrible, innocent and guilty. Contemporary interpretations sometimes struggle with this complexity, preferring narratives that fit more neatly into categories of oppressor and oppressed. Perhaps the most productive approach to Medusa's story is to recognize that it can support multiple interpretations simultaneously. She can be read as a victim of divine injustice and as a powerful figure who transcends simple categorization. Her transformation can represent both the terrible consequences of trauma and the potential for that trauma to be transformed into a source of strength and protection. The feminist reinterpretation of Medusa has undoubtedly enriched our understanding of her story by revealing dimensions of meaning that previous generations had overlooked or suppressed. But it has also raised important questions about the relationship between mythological interpretation and political activism, between academic scholarship and contemporary social concerns. What seems clear is that Medusa's story continues to speak powerfully to contemporary audiences precisely because it addresses issues that remain urgent and unresolved in our own society. The questions raised by her narrative about justice, power, victim blaming, and the transformation of trauma into strength are as relevant today as they were 3,000 years ago. Whether we read her as victim or monster, symbol or individual, ancient myth or contemporary metaphor, Medusa remains what she has always been, a figure who forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the world we live in and the stories we tell ourselves about justice, power, and the treatment of those who are different or threatening. Her gaze still has the power to petrify, But perhaps what it turns to stone is not flesh, but the comfortable assumptions that allow us to avoid grappling with the complexity of human experience and the persistence of systemic injustice. While Medusa's story exists primarily in the realm of mythology and literary interpretation, archaeologists and historians have uncovered fascinating evidence about how her image and narrative functioned in the actual daily life of ancient Mediterranean cultures. These discoveries provide crucial context for understanding not just the story itself, but the society that created and preserved it across centuries. The earliest known representations of Medusa date back to the 7th century before the Common Era, appearing on pottery, coins, and architectural decorations throughout the Greek world. These early images are strikingly different from later, more humanized versions. They show a truly monstrous figure with bulging eyes, protruding tongue, and hair that is clearly composed of writhing snakes rather than human locks. Archaeological evidence suggests that these early Medusa images served primarily apotropaic functions. They were meant to ward off evil and protect the spaces or objects they decorated. Her image appeared on shields carried by warriors, on the walls of homes and temples, and on everyday objects like cups and jewelry. The ancient Greeks believed that Medusa's terrifying appearance could frighten away malevolent spirits, enemy soldiers, and bad luck. One of the most significant archaeological discoveries related to Medusa was the excavation of the Temple of Artemis at Corfu, dating to around 590 BCE. The temple's massive pediment features a central figure of Medusa, flanked by her children Pegasus and Chrysaor, all rendered in limestone relief that still retains traces of its original vivid coloring. This temple decoration is important because it shows Medusa in a context that emphasizes her maternal, rather than purely monstrous nature. She is portrayed as a powerful protective figure watching over the sacred space, her frightening appearance serving to defend rather than threaten. The inclusion of her children in the scene reinforces the interpretation of Medusa as a complex figure who embodied both destructive and creative forces. Excavations at Athena's temple on the Athenian Acropolis have revealed multiple artifacts related to Medusa, including small bronze figurines that may have been votive offerings and pottery fragments decorated with scenes from Perseus's quest. Interestingly, some of these artifacts show Athena herself carrying or displaying Medusa's head, suggesting that the goddess incorporated her former priestess's power into her own divine arsenal. The historical Athena Parthenos statue, the massive gold and ivory sculpture that dominated the interior of the Parthenon, featured Medusa's head prominently displayed on the goddess's aegis, a protective breastplate or shield. This placement was highly significant, as it suggested that Medusa's power had become an integral part of Athena's own divine authority. Archaeological evidence from across the Mediterranean shows that Medusa's image was adapted and modified by different cultures according to their own artistic traditions and religious beliefs. Etruscan versions of Medusa often emphasized her more human qualities, portraying her with recognizable facial features and expressions that conveyed sadness or pain rather than pure rage. Roman archaeological sites have yielded thousands of Medusa images, from massive architectural sculptures to tiny pieces of jewelry. The Romans were particularly fond of using her image in military contexts, decorating armor, weapons, and military standards with her likeness. This suggests that they understood her primarily as a symbol of protective power, rather than as a figure of evil. One of the most intriguing archaeological discoveries related to Medusa was found in a Roman villa in Pompeii, preserved by the volcanic eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE. A fresco in the villa shows what appears to be Perseus holding Medusa's severed head, but the artist has depicted her face as beautiful rather than monstrous, with only subtle snake-like elements in her hair. This Pompeian fresco suggests that by the Roman period, artists were beginning to explore more sympathetic interpretations of Medusa's character, emphasizing her tragic rather than purely terrifying aspects. The beautiful face on the severed head creates a disturbing tension that may reflect growing awareness of the injustice of her story. Excavations of ancient Greek sanctuaries have also revealed evidence of how Medusa's story was connected to actual religious practices. At several sites, archaeologists have found small clay tablets inscribed with prayers or curses that invoke Medusa's power. These tablets suggest that some ancient Greeks believed they could call upon her protective abilities for their own purposes. Particularly interesting are discoveries from women's religious sites, where Medusa imagery appears alongside symbols associated with fertility, childbirth, and female power. This archaeological evidence supports the interpretation of Medusa as a figure who retained connections to feminine divine authority despite her transformation into a monster. The historical context revealed by archaeological research also helps explain why Medusa's story took the forms that it did. The Greece of the 8th through 5th centuries BCE was a society undergoing rapid social and political change, with traditional religious practices being challenged by new philosophical and artistic movements. In this context, Medusa's transformation from priestess to monster can be understood as reflecting anxieties about changing gender roles, evolving religious practices, and the relationship between divine and human authority. Her story may have served as a way for ancient Greeks to explore and process these cultural tensions in mythological form. Archaeological evidence also suggests that the story of Perseus and Medusa was used for educational purposes in ancient Greek society. Pottery designed for use in symposiums and other educational gatherings often featured scenes from their encounter, suggesting that the myth was considered suitable for moral and philosophical instruction. The persistence of Medusa imagery across centuries and cultures, as revealed by archaeological research, demonstrates the powerful hold that her story had on the ancient imagination. Even as political systems changed and religious practices evolved, her image continued to appear on everything from grand architectural sculptures to humble household objects. Perhaps most significantly, archaeological evidence shows that ancient artists and craftspeople were constantly reinterpreting and modifying Medusa's image, suggesting that her story was understood as a living narrative that could be adapted to address contemporary concerns rather than a fixed tale with a single correct interpretation. The material culture surrounding Medusa reveals a society that was deeply engaged with questions about power, justice, transformation, and the relationship between beauty and terror. Her image served multiple functions simultaneously: protective talisman, artistic subject, religious symbol, and political metaphor. This archaeological context enriches our understanding of Medusa's story by showing how it functioned not just as literature or mythology, but as a lived aspect of ancient culture that shaped and reflected the daily experiences of ordinary people. The priestess who became a monster was not just a character in stories, but a presence in the material world, her image offering protection, inspiring fear, and prompting reflection about the nature of divine justice and human suffering. The archaeological record also reveals something fascinating about the evolution of Medusa's story over time. Earlier representations tend to emphasize her monstrous aspects, while later ones gradually humanize her, suggesting that ancient attitudes toward her character were not static, but evolved in response to changing cultural values and artistic sensibilities. This material evidence provides crucial support for contemporary interpretations that emphasize the complexity and ambiguity of Medusa's character. The ancient Greeks themselves, as revealed through their art and religious practices, understood her as a figure who embodied multiple, sometimes contradictory qualities: protector and threat, victim and monster, human and divine. As we reach the end of our journey through the labyrinthine story of Medusa, we find ourselves not at a conclusion, but at a beginning. Her tale, which started in the sacred precincts of Athena's temple over 2.5 millennia ago, continues to evolve and transform in our own time, proving that some stories are too powerful, too essential to human experience, to ever truly end. What makes Medusa's story so enduring is not its simple narrative structure, but its profound complexity, its refusal to fit into easy categories of good and evil, victim and villain, monster and human. She remains what she has always been, a mirror that reflects our deepest fears and most difficult questions about justice, power, transformation, and the price of being different in a world that demands conformity. The young priestess who once tended Athena's sacred fire with devotion and hope has become one of the most recognizable figures in world culture, her image appearing on everything from ancient Greek pottery to contemporary fashion accessories. But this ubiquity has not diminished her power to disturb and provoke. If anything, her continued presence in our cultural consciousness suggests that the questions raised by her story have never been more relevant. In our own time, as we grapple with issues of sexual violence, institutional betrayal, and the ways that victims are blamed for the crimes committed against them, Medusa's transformation takes on new urgency and meaning. Her story speaks to anyone who has ever been punished for someone else's crime, who has been transformed by trauma into something unrecognizable even to themselves, who has found that the very institutions meant to protect them have instead become sources of additional harm. But Medusa's legacy extends beyond her role as a symbol of victimization. Her story also speaks to the possibility of transformation, of finding power in the midst of powerlessness, of creating meaning from suffering. The serpents that crowned her head, the gaze that turned flesh to stone, the isolation that separated her from human society, all of these can be read not just as punishments, but as forms of protection, ways of ensuring that she would never again be vulnerable to the kind of violence that had destroyed her former life. The birth of Pegasus and Chryser from her death blood suggests that even the most devastating endings can give rise to new forms of beauty and power. Her children embodied the artistic inspiration and divine justice that she herself had been denied in life, proving that death is not always defeat, and that the stories we tell about transformation are as important as the transformations themselves. Perseus, the hero who killed her, carried her head as both weapon and burden, discovering that great power comes with great responsibility, and that victory can sometimes feel more like tragedy. His story, intertwined forever with hers, reminds us that heroes and monsters are often more closely connected than we might wish to acknowledge, that the line between justice and violence is thinner than we like to admit. The evolution of Medusa's image across 3,000 years of human culture demonstrates something fundamental about the way mythology functions in human society. These ancient stories are not museum pieces, but living narratives that each generation reshapes to address its own concerns and challenges. The monster who terrified ancient Greeks has become an inspiration to contemporary survivors of trauma. The victim who was blamed for her own assault has become a symbol of resistance against victim-blaming culture. This transformation of meaning is not a distortion of Medusa's true story, but a continuation of it. Mythology has always been a collaborative process, a conversation between past and present, between the stories we inherit and the meanings we create. Medusa's narrative remains vital precisely because it continues to change, to grow, to speak to new audiences in new ways. The archaeological evidence reveals that even in ancient times, her story was understood differently by different communities and adapted to serve various purposes. The Medusa who protected Athenian homes from evil influences was not the same as the Medusa who decorated Roman military equipment, or the Medusa who appeared in women's religious contexts. Each culture, each generation, each individual artist found in her story the elements that spoke most powerfully to their own experiences and concerns. This multiplicity of meanings is not a weakness in Medusa's story, but its greatest strength. She can simultaneously represent the dangers of female power and the tragedy of female victimization, the terror of transformation and the possibility of transcendence, the isolation of being different and the protection that comes from being feared. Her gaze, which turned living flesh to stone, can be understood as a metaphor for the way that trauma freezes us in moments of pain, or as a symbol of the power to stop others in their tracks, to force them to confront truths they would rather avoid. Her serpentine hair can represent the corruption of natural beauty, or the wisdom that comes from embracing our own wildness. Her death can symbolize the silencing of female voices, or the birth of new forms of creative power. The genius of Medusa's story lies in its refusal to resolve these contradictions, its insistence that truth is complex and that the most important questions rarely have simple answers. She embodies the fundamental ambiguity of human experience, the way that we are all simultaneously innocent and guilty, beautiful and monstrous, powerful and vulnerable. In our contemporary moment, as we work to create more just and equitable societies, Medusa's story offers both warning and inspiration. Her transformation reminds us of the terrible consequences of institutional failure, of what happens when those who are supposed to protect the vulnerable instead blame them for their own victimization. But her endurance, her continued presence in our cultural imagination, also suggests the possibility of surviving even the most devastating transformations, of finding ways to turn trauma into strength and isolation into protection. The priestess who became a monster, who became a symbol, who became an inspiration. Medusa's transformations continue, as countless and varied as the people who find meaning in her story. She remains what she has always been, a figure who forces us to look, really look at the complexity of existence, the persistence of injustice, and the strange ways that beauty and terror intertwine in human experience. Her gaze still has the power to petrify, but perhaps what it turns to stone now is not flesh, but complacency, not bodies, but the comfortable assumptions that allow us to avoid grappling with difficult truths. In looking at Medusa, really looking, not turning away in fear or disgust, we might find not death, but transformation, not monstrosity, but humanity, in all its beautiful, terrible complexity. The story that began with a young woman believing that the gods would protect her ends with the recognition that protection, justice, and meaning are things we must create for ourselves and each other. Medusa's legacy is not her monstrosity, but her persistence, not her death, but her continued life in the stories we tell and retell, the meanings we make and remake, the transformations we undergo and help others to survive. 3,000 years after her death on a beach at the edge of the known world, Medusa's voice still echoes through our culture, reminding us that some stories are too important to ever truly end, that some questions are too essential to ever be fully answered, and that some figures are too powerful to ever be completely understood. She was a priestess. She was a victim. She was a monster. She was a mother. She was a symbol. She was a warning. She was an inspiration. She was and remains entirely, eternally, impossibly human. And her story, like all the best stories, has no ending because it is still being written, still being lived, still being transformed by everyone who encounters it and finds in it something that speaks to their own experience of what it means to be human in a world that is both beautiful and terrible, just and unjust, protective and threatening. Medusa's gaze has lost none of its power across the centuries. It still compels us to look, to question, to transform. And in looking back at her, we might just discover something essential about ourselves. The serpents in her hair still writhe. The questions in her story still burn. And we are still, all of us, learning what it means to survive our own transformations.